Picture the moment one sentence becomes a death warrant. A commander reports that the front is bending, the maps are bleeding red, and every instinct of war says pull back, shorten the line, save the men. Then Berlin answers with a command that sounds heroic and ends in slaughter. No retreat. It's easy to hear that phrase and imagine steel and discipline. It's harder to picture what it does to bodies, to supply columns, to winter rations, to wounded men on frozen roads. In the East, the hold-fast idea didn't merely demand courage, it demanded the impossible, and when reality refused, it collected payment in mass casualties. The number often attached to this story, 2 million, isn't just a statistic for a thumbnail. It's a warning about what happens when ideology replaces operational sense, when pride replaces maneuver, and when a single voice at the top turns flexibility into treason. Tonight we're following the trail of that order, how it formed, how it spread, where it reached its most infamous climax, and why it ate an army instead of saving one. Before Stalingrad, you have to go back to the winter when Hitler decided that yielding ground was more dangerous than losing men. In late 1941, after the drive on Moscow stalled and Soviet counterattacks ripped into exhausted German lines, the Wehrmacht faced something it had not planned for: a long war of attrition in freezing weather, with overstretched supply routes and formations already worn thin. To Hitler, retreat wasn't just a tactical move. It looked like the first domino of 1918, the kind of giving way he believed turned setbacks into collapse and collapse into political humiliation. So he began turning flexibility into a moral test. Commanders who pulled back to form shorter, defensible lines were accused of weakness, and the idea of standing fast became a personal doctrine tied to his authority. He dismissed or sidelined senior officers who argued for operational freedom, tightened his grip on decision-making, and treated terrain like a symbol: villages, ridgelines, river bends, places that had to be held because he said so. Some historians note that in that chaotic winter, refusing a headlong flight may have helped prevent a full rout in places, but the habit it formed was lethal, a system where reality could scream, "withdraw," and the answer, again and again, was not one step. By the summer of 1942, Hitler tried to turn that doctrine into a decisive victory, and he did it by gambling on geography itself. Operation Blue, Fall Blau, a renewed drive into southern Russia aimed at the Caucasus Oil and the Volga. The plan opened on June 28, 1942, and at first it looked like the old lightning war again. Soviet units reeling back, long columns pushing east, German headquarters talking about one more great encirclement. But Hitler didn't just want a breakthrough, he wanted everything at once. In July, he split Army Group South into Army Group A to surge toward the Caucasus and Army Group B to drive on Stalingrad and the Volga, two massive offensives feeding on the same strained rail lines, the same fuel stocks, the same overworked logistics. That decision scattered strength across distance and time, and it turned an operational campaign into a test of willpower. Stalingrad, in particular, became more than a city. It became a symbol, and symbols are dangerous in war because they tempt leaders to ignore the math. The deeper the Germans pushed, the longer the supply lines grew, and the more the flanks were stretched, often held by Allied formations with fewer anti-tank guns and thinner reserves. The stage was being built for a siege on the Volga, and for an order that would soon make retreat not merely undesirable, but forbidden. Stalingrad did not begin as a prophecy of ruin. It began as a mission that kept expanding until it became a cage. The city mattered because it sat on the Volga, an artery for Soviet transport, and because it carried Stalin's name, a psychological prize Hitler could present as destiny. In late August 1942, the Luftwaffe's bombs turned districts into ash and rubble, and the fighting slid into a nightmare where every factory hall, stairwell, and basement became a front line. Here, the no-retreat mentality grew teeth. Commanders were ordered to take and hold ground measured in meters, not miles, and the battle became a grinder that rewarded neither speed nor brilliance, only endurance. At the centre stood General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army, an officer known more for staff precision than improvisational daring, now tasked with finishing a job that refused to finish. Across the river, Soviet forces under Vasily Chuikov learned to fight so close that German artillery and air power risked hitting their own men, hugging the enemy, turning rubble into protection. While the Sixth Army bled itself forward, its flanks stretched wider and thinner, guarded by Romanian, Italian and Hungarian units spread over open steppe. The city became the obsession, and the obsession became policy. Hitler's headquarters treated Stalingrad as a line that could not move, as if movement itself was failure. The more the Germans invested in taking the ruins, the less freedom they had to respond to the larger danger gathering in the cold beyond them. What looked like determination on paper was, in reality, the slow locking of a door from the inside. The trap snapped shut in November 1942, and it snapped shut because war punishes fixations. On November 19th, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, not as a frontal assault into Stalingrad's rubble, but as a wide, calculated strike into the weaker flanks north and south of the city, sectors held largely by Romanian armies with limited anti-tank weapons and thin reserves. Soviet armour and infantry surged through the steppe, broke the lines, and raced for the crossings and junctions that mattered. Within days, the two pincers met at Kalach on the Don, and the Sixth Army, along with parts of the Fourth Panzer Army and other units, found itself encircled in what the Germans would call the Kessel, the cauldron. The numbers inside that ring were vast, hundreds of thousands of men, plus horses, vehicles, wounded, and a collapsing logistics system that suddenly had no rear. Paulus asked the question any trapped commander asks: can we break out while we still have fuel and cohesion? But the answer from Hitler's headquarters was the answer his doctrine was built to deliver. Hold your positions, form a fortress, wait for relief. In that moment, no retreat stopped being a slogan and became a mechanism. It removed time from the equation, as if time could be ordered to obey. The city that had been a trophy was now an anchor, and the army that had been a weapon of movement was commanded to stay still while the enemy tightened the wire. Uranus was not just an operation, it was a referendum on whether willpower could replace manoeuvre, and the verdict was already forming in the snow. Here is where the story turns from disaster into irreversible catastrophe, because encirclement alone doesn't kill an army, the refusal to move does. Inside the pocket, Paulus and his staff faced a brutal reality. The longer they stayed, the more fuel would vanish, the more ammunition would be rationed, the more wounded would accumulate, and the weaker any breakout would become. Outside the pocket, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was given a relief mission, Operation Winter Storm, a thrust in December meant to punch towards Stalingrad and open a corridor. Manstein understood what holding really meant. Relief could only work if the Sixth Army moved at the same time, meeting the rescue with a breakout that traded ground for survival. But Hitler's orders locked Paulus in place. Paulus, cautious, obedient, and tied to a command culture that punished independent retreat as mutiny, did not break out on his own authority. The Sixth Army waited, and the wait became a slow bleeding. Winter Storm pushed forward, fought hard, and came within striking distance, close enough for desperate hope, not close enough to change the map. Soviet resistance stiffened, reserves counterattacked, and the relief stalled. And still the orders did not change. In the frozen pocket, a question spread from officers to enlisted men. Are we being rescued or are we being sacrificed? That's the moment no retreat reveals its true nature. It doesn't demand courage in battle. It demands submission to a fantasy. As days passed, the pocket shrank, and every hour of obedience reduced the Sixth Army's ability to save itself. The climax wasn't a single explosion. It was a decision repeated over and over. Stay, even when staying meant dying where you stood. And then the war became arithmetic, the kind no speech can intimidate. How many men, how many calories, how many shells, how many litres of fuel, and how many tons of supply could possibly reach a pocket surrounded by Soviet guns and winter skies? Hitler's headquarters clung to a promise that sounded like salvation. The Luftwaffe would fly in what the Sixth Army needed, as if air could replace roads. Hermann Göring assured Hitler it could be done, and a target was spoken of in the language of logistics, hundreds of tons per day, because that's what an encircled force of that size required just to keep fighting and feeding itself. But the airlift ran into physics, weather, and enemy action. Freezing fog grounded planes, Soviet fighters, and anti-aircraft fire chewed up transport runs, and the few usable airfields inside the pocket, like Pitomnik and later Gumrak, became choke points under constant attack, then craters, then silence. Aircraft that were never meant to be cargo haulers, bombers pressed into transport duty, arrived with partial loads and departed with wounded stacked like freight, and even that evacuation collapsed as the perimeter tightened. On the ground, rations shrank into symbols, bread measured in thin slices, horse meat when the horses ran out, then nothing but hunger and cold working together. Ammunition was hoarded for the next assault that might never come. Fuel was husbanded until vehicles became immobile anyway. Frostbite and disease spread through men who could no longer move to warm themselves. This is where no retreat becomes more than a battlefield command. It becomes a system that turns an army into a trapped population, living on promises, starving on schedules, and waiting for a rescue that the sky could not physically deliver. By January 1943, holding fast no longer meant holding a line. It meant holding on to life in a pocket that was collapsing like a dying lung. The Soviets tightened the ring with methodical pressure, splitting the encircled force into smaller fragments, isolating units, overrunning positions that no longer had the strength to counterattack. The last major airfields fell or became unusable, and with them went the last illusion of a functioning lifeline. Paulus's headquarters moved from one ruined shelter to another as the front came closer, and the Sixth Army's world shrank into cellars, rubble, and snow-choked streets where men fought not for victory, but for one more day without surrender. Then came the moment heavy with symbolism. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal, a rank loaded with an implication the German tradition understood, because no German field marshal had ever surrendered in the field. It was pressure dressed as honour. Die or do the impossible, but do not capitulate. Yet by then the decision had already been made by hunger, cold, and ammunition counts. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered in the southern pocket. In the north, the last resistance ended on February 2nd. The no-retreat order did not preserve the Sixth Army. It preserved a myth until the myth ran out of bodies to pay for it. And that surrender did not just remove an army from the map, it sent a shock through Germany and its allies, because it proved something the regime tried to deny. Willpower could not reverse encirclement, and slogans could not feed men. Stalingrad became the name of a turning point, not because the Germans lost ground, but because they lost the ability to pretend the war could be commanded by refusal alone. Stalingrad was the most famous corpse of the no-retreat idea, but it wasn't the only one, and that's where the real bill swells. Once Hitler proved to himself that he could overrule reality and still be obeyed, the method hardened into habit. When the front bent, he didn't ask how to trade space for time. He demanded immobility, and immobility on the Eastern Front was often another word for encirclement. In 1942, there were pockets that briefly worked just enough to poison the mind, like Demyansk, where a surrounded force was supplied from the air and held on, an exception that encouraged Göring and Hitler to believe Stalingrad could be repeated in reverse, as if one miracle could become a system. Then came the pattern, threatened salients ordered to stand, withdrawals delayed until roads were cut, hold at all costs becoming die in place. As the war turned against Germany in 1943 and 1944, the doctrine spread from armies to cities. Hitler declared fortress positions, places that had to be defended as symbols, turning urban centres into traps for garrisons and civilians alike, forcing commanders to fight for ruins long after operational logic demanded movement. On the great Soviet offensives, especially the massive blows of 1944, the consequences were brutal. Units that might have escaped were pinned by orders, then broken apart, then swallowed in rolling encirclements that destroyed not just divisions, but entire front systems. This is why the casualty numbers become so monstrous, because the no-retreat concept doesn't create one disaster. It manufactures repeatable disasters, multiplying losses whenever momentum shifts. Stalingrad became the headline, but the deeper story is that an order meant to prevent collapse kept producing it, again and again, until the war's final year was crowded with pockets, fortresses, and armies dying where they were told to stand. So when people put 2 million casualties next to Hitler's no-retreat idea, the most honest way to understand that number is not as a single ledger line for one city, but as a symbol for what rigid command can do across an entire front. Losses killed, wounded, missing, captured, and exhausted into non-existence as the war's balance turned. Stalingrad alone produced staggering totals on both sides, and the Sixth Army's destruction became the clearest exhibit in the case against the doctrine. But the wider no-step-back mentality helped shape a string of later calamities where time and space, two currencies an army must spend wisely, were forbidden expenditures until it was too late. Many historians frame Hitler's interference as a central cause. He undermined the German tradition of mission command by substituting personal will for operational judgment, rewarding obedience over adaptability, and making withdrawal politically criminal. Others add the darker truth that even when a temporary stand could stabilize a front, it only worked if paired with elastic defense, mobile reserves, and realistic logistics, things Germany increasingly lacked as Soviet strength surged and Allied pressure mounted. And then comes the verdict that feels like a forensic conclusion, not a slogan. The no-retreat order did not save the army it claimed to protect. It converted defeat into annihilation. It took losses that might have been survivable, retreats, reorganizations, shortened lines, and turned them into pockets and mass surrenders, the kind that don't just cost men, they erase formations, experience, and the future. And if you listen closely, you can hear the echo back to where we began. One sentence, spoken as strength, becoming a death warrant, because in war, refusing to move can be the most dangerous movement of all.